when we compared Rosanne Cash's DNA to that of other people who've been in our series, we found a significant match. Evidence of a relative she didn't know she had.
Johnny Cash, the rebel, the voice of the outcasts, the icon of American music, often spoke of having Native American ancestry. He sang for the silenced and stood with the marginalized. But recent DNA testing has called that claim into question and uncovered a deeper, more complex truth about his heritage. Why did his family hold on to this belief for generations? Was it an honest mistake, or a story crafted to conceal something more controversial? And what does this revelation mean for the legacy of a man who symbolized authenticity? We'll examine the genetic evidence, explore the origins of the myth, and uncover the unexpected truths that reshape the story of Johnny Cash, the public legend built on myth. For decades, Johnny Cash stood as more than a musical icon. He was a symbol, a towering figure cloaked in black, representing the rebellious spirit of America's overlooked and oppressed. His deep voice and haunting lyrics didn't just echo from radio speakers, they seeped into the cultural fabric of a nation struggling with its conscience. The public saw in him a man who lived through torment and redemption, who understood pain without needing to explain it. He wasn't just singing about prison life or rural hardship. He felt those stories, or so we believed. But underneath the mythology, a more complex, and perhaps fabricated, identity was quietly taking shape. One of the most persistent elements of Johnny Cash's personal narrative was his claim of Cherokee ancestry. It wasn't a throwaway detail or occasional quip. It was, for many years, part of his public identity. He spoke of it with sincerity in interviews. He referenced it when explaining his outlook on life, justice, and spirituality. He even built it into his art. In 1964, Cash released an album titled Bitter Tears: Ballads of the American Indian. The project was a bold move for a country artist at the time, a protest album at the height of civil unrest in the U.S., dedicated entirely to Native American issues. Cash not only recorded songs about Native suffering and injustice, but he also defended the album fiercely. When country radio stations refused to play it, he took out a full-page ad in Billboard magazine, calling out the industry's silence and cowardice. That moment further entrenched his reputation as a fearless truth-teller, a man whose music wasn't about commercial trends, it was about conscience. For millions of fans, Cash's Native ancestry helped explain his empathy, his connection to injustice, his spiritual outlook. It made sense. Here was a man whose blood tied him to people who had been persecuted, displaced, and forgotten. The mythology worked. It fit with the rest of the legend. He carried on with that identity for decades. He even performed in a Native-themed television special. His presentation of his faith included references to tribal spirituality. His outfit, in all black, seemed consistent with that of mourning and resistance. However, it was a potent enough tale to collapse in 2021. That year, Johnny's daughter, Rosanne Cash, a successful musician in her own right and an activist, participated in the PBS genealogy series Finding Your Roots, expecting to illustrate the family lore. For all her life, she believed that she and her father shared Cherokee blood. Nothing was said about it being a theory. It was treated as fact. Stories about the family retold with conviction made it an emotional truth passed on for generations. But the test results rolled in, and they spelled a reality unlike the myth. Rosanne's DNA showed no traces of Native American ancestry. Not one. The story from the get-go, which had been told and retold in interviews and albums and public statements, falls flat on its face in biological terms. It left doubts on some details of Cash's life, but it went a long way in undermining a very fundamental part of the persona that fashioned his career. In another sense, however, this public wisdom was less a flat contradiction then it was a door. For if a native ancestry could have once declared Cash's empathy for the marginalized, DNA revealed far more unthinkable and infinitely more complex. That missing Cherokee ancestry was only half the story. What the test did reveal pointed to a hidden past, one that Johnny Cash himself may never have known. But that changes everything. The DNA revelation. When Rosanne Cash sat down for her episode of Finding Your Roots, she expected to confirm what she believed was family truth. Raised on the story of her Cherokee lineage, passed down directly from her father, she likely anticipated a moment of validation. Instead, what she received was a revelation so profound that it shook the very foundation of Johnny Cash's public identity, and perhaps, unknowingly, her own. The test results were clear. Rosanne had no Native American ancestry in her genetic makeup. None. Not even a trace percentage that could be explained away or dismissed. According to host Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., the sequencing had been exhaustive. The data was irrefutable. The family story that had shaped personal identity, inspired activism, and helped create a myth around Johnny Cash was, in fact, scientifically false. But the truth didn't stop there. As the results went deeper, another, far more astonishing discovery surfaced. Rosanne carried a measurable amount of sub-Saharan African DNA, not from her mother's side, but from her paternal line. This implied that her African ancestry came from none other than Johnny Cash himself. The implications were staggering. Here was Johnny Cash, born in 1932 in the deeply segregated American South, a white man by appearance and societal classification, a man who built his career in the overwhelmingly white world of country music, carrying African American heritage that had been buried, forgotten, or deliberately obscured. Is Johnny in Ireland, not thinking of his own heritage? Perhaps he knew something about it and considered it better kept to himself, since he would have had the rabid approbation of his own culture at that particular time about him. But speculation as historians, not to mention family members, is not any better than no. He probably didn't. No record, interview, letter, or reference, even quiet ones. As far as it seemed, it would have been buried by everything that happened generations before he was born, really hidden underneath misdirection, most certainly because of necessity, not deceit. In the American South, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, families with ambiguous or mixed-race backgrounds would often claim Native American ancestry as a socially acceptable explanation for certain physical features or genealogical gaps. More often, it was just a tale one kept hearing over and over until it became gospel. Better to be part Cherokee than to admit to having a black ancestor, even in a time and place where that truth could mean exclusion, violence, or even death. Thus, this reframing can now be read as one corrective to Johnny Cash's long-standing claim of Native heritage. What if it were not just a misperception, but a multicultural, intergenerational defense? A story that doesn't deceive, but must be followed for survival? Cash's disquieting tie with such marginalized communities gets meaning within that reality. Could his then legendary empathy, which included prisoner advocacy, protest songs, and insistence on giving voice to the voiceless, have been driven not only by the life experiences of Johnny Cash, but an unspoken legacy buried deep within his own bloodline? It is a murky question without simple answers, but it compels us to see Cash not only as a man of conviction, but as one perhaps unwittingly shaped by an outsized reality. So, son of Arkansas sharecroppers, Cash was raised in an international household, never realizing he was creating a storyline more complex, more American, and far more tied to the nation's racial history than he could have imagined. And the timing of that ancestral link? Scientists traced it to a single hidden ancestor, someone whose life, lived centuries ago, may have rewritten Johnny Cash's legacy before it even began. Lies and survival in the South. For generations, Southern families passed down stories, some myth, some strategic, to protect their legacies and their lives. In Johnny Cash's case, the long-held belief in Cherokee ancestry wasn't a harmless family tale. It was a survival tactic, one likely designed to obscure something far more dangerous in a racially divided society: African ancestry. The recent DNA discovery confirming sub-Saharan African lineage in Cash's bloodline raises troubling questions. Was the Cherokee claim a willful lie, or an inherited defense mechanism crafted to navigate an unforgiving world? To understand the stakes, we must go back to the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in states like Arkansas and Mississippi, where Cash's roots ran deep. In that world, race wasn't just a social distinction. It was codified in law. Under the one-drop rule, anyone with even a trace of African ancestry could be classified as colored, losing rights, property, and social standing. In such a system, families with ambiguous features often passed for white, with native ancestry offered as a safer explanation for non-European traits. This is likely where the Cash family's Cherokee narrative began. Somewhere in the family tree, 5 to 7 generations back, someone with African heritage chose, or was forced, to tell a different story. That story, repeated across generations, eventually became truth. And while it may have protected the family from racial persecution, it also erased their real identity. This was a common survival strategy in the South. Many families erased their African roots not out of shame, but out of necessity. The cost of honesty was too high. By rewriting themselves as white or part Cherokee, they gained safety, legal rights, and access to opportunities that otherwise would have been denied. But in doing so, they lost their true lineage, their culture, and often their sense of connection to a deeper history. Johnny Cash would grow up in an unsparing setting. Brought up in Depression-era Arkansas, he saw poverty, alienation, and a violent sense of injustice. He often sang for the voiceless, the imprisoned, the poor, the forgotten. But now, we must ask, was his compassion rooted only in personal suffering, or was it something older, something passed on from ancestors who knew what it was to live erased? Cash never acknowledged Black ancestry in public. Perhaps he never knew. Or perhaps he instinctively knew that to say such a thing would be to end his career. The country music world during the 1950s and 60s was ruled by its white gatekeepers aimed at an audience of white souls. Just a whisper of Black ancestry could get one blackballed from the industry. That same culture that was giving him cheers on stage would have slammed shut every door had his ancestry been revealed. According to the Cherokee myth, the family's cover was a socially acceptable excuse for any ambiguous features or histories. The price was steep: generations of erased identity, lost cultural ties, and a false memory exaggerated into fact. The connection Cash appears to have formed now with outcasts and marginalized people felt like an ancestral one. His advocacy for Native Americans, concern for prisoners, and songs about injustice carry the resonance of an unacknowledged burden. When the stories of passing become circulation of mere survival, that is where the essence of revelation lies, that it deeply hurts. This, we may say, is not just a family secret. It is a mirror reflecting the very image of a nation forcing an entire people to make their choice between truth and survival on more than one occasion. And just when the story seems to settle, deeper questions emerge from the Cash family tree. Patterns that suggest this wasn't just one family's quiet decision, but part of a larger, systemic effort to control identity, erase heritage, and rewrite history. the man who spoke for the voiceless. Johnny Cash wore black for the forgotten. He sang for the condemned, the addicted, the poor, the imprisoned. For decades, fans and historians praise this as a product of his hard upbringing and deep moral conviction. But after DNA revelations uncovered African ancestry in his bloodline, a new question emerges. Was Cash's empathy simply experiential, or also ancestral? Cash's work was never just about entertainment. While many country stars sang about bars and heartbreak, he dug deeper. His albums explored injustice and loss. His concerts at Folsom and San Quentin weren't stunts. They were statements. In his 1971 protest anthem, The Man in Black, he sang, "I wear the black for the poor and the beaten down, for the prisoner who has long paid for his crime." His music wasn't a performance. It was a purpose. And perhaps that purpose came from more than personal conviction. The sub-Saharan African ancestry discovered through his daughter Roseanne's DNA suggests a lineage that included someone who lived in bondage or in its shadow, someone enslaved, undocumented, or deliberately erased from public records. That past, hidden for survival, may have echoed across generations, shaping instincts, values, and a worldview Cash couldn't fully explain. Psychologists call it generational memory, the idea that trauma and survival can pass through families like inheritance, even without words. Cash's obsession with justice, his stubborn compassion, and his refusal to conform now seem more than artistic choices. They feel like echoes, not of others' stories, but perhaps of his own, buried deep in time. His connection to marginalized groups extended far beyond sympathy. In 1964, he released Bitter Tears, Ballads of the American Indian, a concept album protesting Native American mistreatment. When country radio refused to play it, Cash bought a full-page ad in Billboard to shame them. At the time, many assumed his passion came from personal identity. He'd claimed Cherokee ancestry. But DNA tests found no native lineage. So was it appropriation or something deeper? Slightly, quite possibly. One idea is that a Cherokee identity was a family myth, one constructed to explain features or feelings that would not fit into the accepted racial narrative. Down south, claims of any native ancestry were one way to veil traces of African heritage, claiming it offered a socially acceptable alternative to the truth. Cash might have sincerely embraced the native identity, a way to articulate something he could not concretely identify, the sense of erasure, of difference, of the loss handed down across generations. But what matters here is what he did with that identity. In an era when few country artists would speak out, Cash did so for the war, for the impoverished, for the prison industrial complex. And not only in the interviews, but in song after song, in this realm of country music that never so readily embraces dissent. His voice felt authentically raised, now understood as having resonance beyond mere performance. Perhaps biologically so, a subconscious bond to those denied their own voice for so very long. More tragic is that Cash possibly never knew. In segregated America, he was a white man. He savored the advantages and blind spots of that persona. His art bore deep witness to his empathy. However, his ability to understand the how of the empathy eluded him. He would never understand fully the why of his connection with those whom society defined as castaways. This is what the audience and scholars must now begin to look at. His empathy was not mere posturing. Instead, it was in his very fabric. Perhaps it was a sort of unspoken remembrance of a buried connection to the struggles of the people he unsuccessfully defended that allowed him to disregard contemporary genre policies with the music industry and social culture. And the proof isn't just in his music. It's in the records, or rather, in what those records tried to hide. In the censuses, the blank racial boxes, the shifting labels, they whisper the truth America wasn't ready to hear, and that Johnny Cash never got to fully know. But still, he sang it, loud, true, and unwavering, what the records tried to hide. When Johnny Cash's DNA results became public, they did more than surprise fans. They sent historians and genealogists racing into archives. Suddenly, long-forgotten census forms, property deeds, and birth records were under scrutiny. What emerged wasn't just a family history. It was a portrait of silence, survival, and intentional erasure, woven into the fabric of American record-keeping. In 19th-century census records across Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi, several of Cash's paternal ancestors appear with inconsistent or ambiguous racial designations. Some were listed as mulatto, a term historically used for people of mixed African and European descent. Others saw their racial category change over time. One decade, they might be mulatto, the next, white. Some records left the race blank altogether. These were not clerical mistakes, they were survival strategies. In the post-Civil War South, the color line wasn't just a social divide, it was a life-or-death boundary. Racial identity could determine where you lived, worked, went to school, or whether you were subjected to segregation laws. For light-skinned families or those with European-sounding surnames, passing as white wasn't merely aspirational. It was protection. A word on a census could mean the difference between owning land or being legally excluded from it. Johnny Cash's ancestors weren't simply lost to history, they were hiding in plain sight. The omissions and inconsistencies in the records were deliberate. Families, and often the officials recording their data, chose vagueness over truth to avoid the consequences of being labeled black. This was a calculated silence, shaped by a brutal racial hierarchy, and it happened then to be the custom of the entire South. African ancestry was buried deep in generations, seeking safety. Mythologies of Native American ancestry were piped into the tale of substitution, especially if the fictitious genealogy included being Cherokee, for such possibilities were considered more socially acceptable. One family narrative would come into place of all the others to be repeated for generations until it became a fact. Then, by the time it got to Johnny Cash, it wouldn't exactly be hiding anything. It would be cultural gospel. Digital archives and DNA testing have now revealed just how widely these omissions were spread. In many of these small towns, people became white, powerful, quiet people who graduated into that unspoken boundary within society. Churches, courthouses, and local officials often cooperated in this erasure, choosing not to document race at all. The lack of data was a shield. Even more unsettling are the property and legal records of Cash's extended family. Some ancestors may have been enslaved or descended from freed people who merged into white communities over time. In the Jim Crow South, racial identity could be redefined simply by living differently, keeping quiet, and fitting in, so long as no one challenged your story. For Cash, who was born in 1932 in Kingsland, Arkansas, a one-way segregated town, these nuances really meant something. Race was enforced via appearance instead of science, rumor, and paperwork. Perceived whiteness equated to access, safety, and everything else denied to most. Their family either fortuitously or strategically avoided the identifiers that would have kept them in the basement inversion of society's ladders. However, such an existence does not rule him out of a trajectory that included some measure of racial exclusion. It simply shows that they barely slipped through. The real tragedy is not that Cash's ancestry was hidden, but that it had to be. Under the system, honesty carried a price too great. For generations, people like Cash's ancestors were compelled to deny themselves in order to live in a society obsessed with racial purity. Now, with the truth emerging, we are finally confronting what the records tried to hide. A story not of shame, but of endurance. And Johnny Cash, long seen as a voice for the forgotten, may have been echoing a deeper legacy all along, one shaped by silence, struggle, and the quiet fight to simply exist. The industry that would have erased him. The music industry embraced Johnny Cash, but only as long as he fit the image it wanted. A white Southern rebel with just enough grit to be edgy, but not enough to disrupt the racial order. Had his African ancestry been known during the height of his fame in the 1950s, that embrace would have quickly turned into rejection. The mid-20th century American music was built on segregation. Country music, in particular, was marketed as white music, controlled by white-owned labels, radio stations, and booking agents. Audiences expected their stars to reflect that ideal, visibly and ancestrally. Any suggestion of black heritage, no matter how distant, would have been career-ending. This wasn't just about prejudice, it was about profit. Labels feared losing Southern audiences if racial lines blurred. Johnny Cash was presented as the voice of white working-class America, a Bible-holding outlaw with a moral compass and a rebel streak. That persona sold records and packed venues, but it was built on the assumption that he was unquestionably white. A different racial narrative, revealed by DNA, family history, or even rumor, could have ended everything before it began. The recent revelation of Cash's African ancestry isn't just a historical footnote. It reveals how precarious his rise really was. In a racially rigid industry, even suspicion of mixed heritage could bar an artist from the stage. Country music made little space for ambiguity. Artists who crossed those boundaries faced resistance and often erasure. Examples abound. When Ray Charles released a country album in 1962, radio stations hesitated to play it because he was black. Charlie Pride, one of the rare black country stars, was advised to downplay his identity in public. Even Elvis Presley, who built his sound on black musical traditions, was careful not to appear too aligned with black artists. The stakes were high, and the message was clear. In that environment, had Johnny Cash been seen as anything other than white, he might never have made it. No Grand Ole Opry, no Folsom Prison concerts, no country legend. So did the fans have very specific expectations that could be quite rigid? The Southern audience expected an image of them when it came to performance. A public revelation about Cash's true legacy would shatter the fantasy and likely end his career, talent notwithstanding. Here, the discovery of DNA is as dauntingly great as it is solemn. It doesn't tarnish Cash's legacy. It brings into focus just how easily it could have been vitiated. The same industry that glorifies him could as well lay him to rest. Knowing this, however, adds a new twist to Cash's artistry. It now seems less instinctual than his ability to marry musical forms, gospel, country, blues. Found in his phrasing, in his emotional range, and in his affinity for the downtrodden are resonances from traditions deeply rooted in African American music. Current scholarship hears echoes of blues and spirituals in his work, not as imitation, but as inheritance. It gives a whole new meaning to his persona, the man in black. He said that he wore black for the forgotten, the poor, and the voiceless. It actually feels prophetic, given the blood running through his veins. Maybe he mourned something deeper, a connection to a history he never even knew was his. The tragedy is not really that Johnny Cash had black ancestry. The tragedy is that he never came to grips with it fully, and perhaps if the world had known, he might never have had the chance to become who he was. But even without knowing, Johnny Cash defied expectations. He gave voice to those on the margins, stood against conformity, and carried within him a story more American than the industry could bear to tell at the time. Today, that story finally gets its place in the light. Rewriting heritage through Johnny Cash. When Johnny Cash's DNA results revealed African ancestry, it sparked more than curiosity. It ignited a deeper reflection on American identity. This revelation wasn't just about one man or his music. It was about the myths America tells itself about race, heritage, and belonging. For decades, Cash symbolized white Southern rebellion. A poor boy from Arkansas turned country music icon, he embodied the American outlaw spirit. But his legacy has always been complex. He was a devout Christian who battled addiction, a country star who fought for prison reform and native rights. Now, the discovery of Black ancestry adds yet another layer to his story, one that reshapes how we view both him and the American narrative. Cash's DNA didn't negate his past, it enriched it. It forced fans and historians to confront a truth often overlooked. American racial history isn't neatly divided. It's tangled and deeply interconnected. Cash, unknowingly, stood as a bridge between two Americas, one white, one black, that have long been told they are separate. His story raises a powerful question. How many American icons, celebrated as symbols of whiteness, carry similarly complex heritages? How much of our cultural identity has been built on simplified, sanitized versions of history? In the South especially, racial lines were often blurred. To survive in a racially stratified society, many families passed as something they were not. Black ancestry was hidden, replaced in family lore with more socially acceptable narratives such as native heritage. These erasures offered protection but came at the cost of truth. Johnny Cash's case is a haunting reminder of the identities lost in the process. Yet, as more grace this revelation, the chance proffered by it is spirited. The rigid racial boundaries are indeed challenged, thus creating a more honest, inclusive vision and reminding us of what it means to be American. A reminder that the identity is not binary. It is layered, developing, and often in plain sight. Cash may not have been aware of his African lineage, yet the focus of his life's work offered an echo to the struggles of the marginalized. He sang for those whom society has forgotten, the imprisoned, the poor, those denied a voice. Looking back, his defiance against power and conformity seems almost genealogical, as if carrying the burden of a history shaping him from within. Modern research provides quite different methodologies for analyzing the past. However, the impact still lies in the use of this knowledge. In Cash's case, it rather deepens than weakens his legacy. He becomes not merely an icon of music, but also a mirror of the American experience, complex and contradictory, with some unexpected connections. This fresh unfolding of Johnny Cash's tale is not so much an end as it is a beginning, inviting us to reconsider definitions of legacy and who belongs in the American narrative. Could it be that the voice which was thought to speak for so many others was actually telling only his story? Johnny Cash becomes more than just an icon. He represents real America, troubled, heterogeneous, and rife with inconvenient truths waiting to emerge. His legacy challenges us to confront that complex reality, thus lending itself an interpretation of what it means to be American. In embracing the full truth of Johnny Cash's heritage, we don't diminish his story, we make it more honest. And in doing so, we open the door for a richer, more inclusive understanding of American identity, one that honors complexity instead of denying it. Johnny Cash's DNA didn't just reveal a personal secret, it tore open a national myth. What do you think? Does this change how we see Johnny Cash? Or does it make his legacy even stronger? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our next video on your screen. Because the next hidden history we uncover might just change everything you thought you knew.